think we'll get to book. It's not? Okay, well, maybe they're controlling. We'll make sure it's working by the time we start. Well, good afternoon. I'm Marvin Weinbaum, a director of the Afghanistan and Pakistan Studies here at the Middle East Institute. And we're pleased to welcome you to today's panel discussion, in which we're going to be looking for some best ways forward in Afghanistan. You know, it's almost 6 months ago since President Trump announced what our strategy would be for Afghanistan, and this was obviously intended to provide clarity here as to what our objectives are and how we choose to meet those objectives. I must say, and you'll probably agree, that after this period of time, there still is some confusion. There still is some doubts here, although I think we'd also say there have been some signs of progress. There are also some disconcerting developments, especially in the last few weeks, which have raised all kinds of questions about what's the best way forward. So I'm just so pleased that we have the panel that we have today. I couldn't have picked a better panel. And what
else would you say here?
Well, yeah, it's true. So let me get started very quickly because we want to have as much time as possible. This is going to be a discussion in which later you're going to be asked or invited to join in. And so it's going to be one in which is framed around some of the questions that I'm going to ask the panelists. So let me introduce then the panelists. Off to my left here we have Ahmad Majidyar, my valued colleague here at MEI. Ahmad has been observing the region closely. His origins are Afghanistan, but most of you know him for his IranObserved, which is a daily internet newsletter, in effect, about Iran's foreign policy. But I just, as I say, value his contribution here on not just Iran, but Afghanistan and Pakistan as well. He was previously with the American Enterprise Institute, and so thank you for joining us, Ahmed.
Thank you.
Ron Neumann, Ambassador Ron Neumann, to my near left. You know, Ron has been following the region since the late 1960s. Yeah, well, you were on that hippie trail, as I recall you're saying, you know, with that microbus that would go across.
My legend is growing outside of reality. But,
I didn't suggest that you were indulging in the things that the hippies did then, because they were quite outlandish in some of the behavior, which I saw firsthand myself. So Ron has been our ambassador to Afghanistan and follows Afghanistan about as closely as anyone does today. He's the president of the American Institute, what is it?
Academy.
American Academy of Diplomacy, yeah. And thank you for joining us, Ron. To my near right is Chris Kolenda, and Chris is an adjunct senior fellow at the Center for New American Security. And he served as a senior advisor on Afghanistan and Pakistan to the Department of Defense, and he's had 4 tours, yes, in Afghanistan. That certainly makes you a veteran. I know that you've also served as assistant professor of history at West Point. Well, we could go on. And then my far right, dear friend, Vanda Felbab-Brown from Brookings. And Vanda is, you know, some of us call her the drug lady. Vanda has about as much expertise today on drug trafficking and the politics of drugs and as anyone across, you know, not just in Afghanistan, but we particularly value her work here in Afghanistan. A recent book of hers has been especially well received, and thank you for joining us. So, just before, though, I'm asked to do something in the way of housekeeping here, if I can find the note here on this. Yeah, okay. Well, I don't seem to find it here. Yeah, but I will say this, that, and this is what the gist of what it was. As you know, we're in the process here of renovating and expanding our Middle East Institute, which, as you know, is around the corner. And that process will go on for a little while yet, but this also coincides with a fundraising campaign that MEI is undertaking so that we can offer the kind of facility that we really look forward to. And that facility, by the way, is going to have an art gallery. It's going to have an auditorium which is considerably larger than this one. So in many ways, we're going to be able to expand our activities, which are already pretty expansive. So as you leave, you'll find there's a pledge card, and we would invite you to take one and contribute if you can, so that we can make this what it is already, and that is a place to go for what's happening in the Middle East, and we want to make it ever more so as in the years to go forward. So let's now get started, and I'm going to raise the first question then. We've heard from the Trump administration and the military that we're in it to win. So I'm asking, what would winning look like in Afghanistan? And what does our presence being conditioned based, what does that mean? So please, no particular order here, who'd like to start us off? Ron?
Okay. Not the first time I've been volunteered. I think the Trump administration actually has arrived at a fairly decent policy, miserably explained. You are certainly right about the lack of clarity. I lecture regularly to people going to Afghanistan. I think for at least the last 4 classes, I've asked for a show of hands of those who feel comfortable that they understand the policy. No hands have ever gone up. And that's a shame, because actually I think there are a couple of things that go to your question. In the president's speech, he talks about no attacks on the United States based out of Afghanistan. This actually reminds me of a much more articulated version of that Chris superintended in his paper, which talked about changing the strategy from one of some undefined victory to removing terrorist threats to the United States. That is a definition of success. It is far less than, first of all, it's far less than surrender on the deck of the Missouri. And secondly, it has in it the potential of a continued level of some level of conflict. It's not peace necessarily. You can, I won't do the argument of whether or not it's a good definition. It may be the only credible definition of success you can have in fighting a non-state actor that has a regenerative capacity. clear victory is not going to, I think, be an option. And that's a problem for Americans because we have a definition of victory in our heads, sort of comes out of World War II. And if that's your definition of victory, then you probably can't have it in dealing with any non-state actor that has a regenerative capacity, in which case you have defined permanent failure. That would be a problem. So I think there is a definition of victory there, of success, not victory really. I think you can argue for it as meeting strategic purpose. But I think first of all, they have an enormous responsibility to clarify that. And secondly, if that is the goal, and if one accepts it, then you are accepting a very long-term commitment. And then there's a sentence in the president's speech talks about sort of this isn't a blank check. This brings one to what I think is an inevitable element of tension in any policy if you're not going to leave Afghanistan, and that is the recognition that the Afghan government has to do better, has to clean up its act in some very important areas. If they don't do that, particularly immediately in the military, if you have ineffective military based on political appointments, which we have seen in other wars, then no matter what we do, we would fail. And so that means you have to have some element of conditionality. And at the same time, you really have to get away from these bloody, stupid time deadlines that the Obama administration continually stuck on the policy, which was almost fatal to it. And so I don't think you can get away from having that element of tension in any Afghan policy. And clearly, that kind of nuance is going to be really rough to explain in short public comments. And I don't think they've done it at all. So what you've got is my interpretation, not theirs. But I think that's where you are on those. I think that's actually the reality of where you are on those 2 points.
Who'd like to jump in now? Vanda.
You know, this notion that our principal goal is to avoiding attack on the United States or perhaps U.S. assets have, of course, been the core objective for all three administrations. Where I think the Trump administration is struggling with the very same issues that the Bush administration, the Obama administration deeply struggled, oscillated, and really at the end didn't resolve, is the same issue. Well, what brings us to it? What kind of conflict, what kind of arrangement is necessary to avoid it? What's the role of safe havens? Is it okay that the Taliban controls maybe southern Afghanistan? What levels of areas are there? What if there is conflict, there is no direct control? Will that allow the preservation of safe havens? So, you know, the goal, no attack on, and what does it require to assure that objective of no attack on the United States or perhaps more expansively U.S. assets? Is simply destroying enough of the militants, whoever they are, whether they are Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, these days ISIS Khorasan, enough? Can that be accomplished through military, through bombing or through military action alone? Or do you need to put in some viable governance? And the Trump administration has not resolved the issues. I would very much posit that the military action alone is not adequate, that there needs to be critical focus on governance. And again, the president comments I don't think are very helpful. In the August speech, he in fact very explicitly said, what happens internally in terms of politics is not our business. We will not be messing in that. His other administration officials later on very much tried to walk these comments back. And yet very recently, President Trump said there are no negotiations with the Taliban. We will not sanction that, which it was very much of a news to a lot of people into the region, including, I would posit, very much of a major news to the Afghan government, and they probably were quite struck by that brief. So while there is perhaps clarity on the fundamental objective for all three administrations, that continues to be real difficulty in resolving what it takes to get to that objective. Can there be a negotiated deal with the Taliban? What can it look like? I also want to...
That's our next question, by the way.
I also want to come to the issue of deadlines. And yes, the deadlines that the Trump administration was imposing turned out to be very counterproductive and quite destabilizing. But let's understand a crucial impetus why they were put in place, namely to get the Afghans to recognize that they need to put their house in order, that they cannot forever rely on the international community, and worse than just rely, that they cannot continue forever rocking the boat, engaging in brinksmanship, engaging in fundamental misgovernance, corruption, power abuse, and constant politicking in Kabul that translates into allowing the potential regeneration and entrenchment that the Taliban has. Now, putting in the deadlines didn't accomplish that. However, I am not persuaded at all, and in fact quite skeptical of the opposite proposition, than simply indicated a long-term commitment and saying, well, what happens internally is your business, is equally problematic.
Ahmed?
Yeah, I think that the United States has had two vital interests in Afghanistan, and these two vital interests have not changed over the past 16 years. The first one is, of course, as other speakers mentioned, is to avoid Afghanistan descending into chaos and anarchy again, that it becomes a launchpad for terrorist attacks against the United States and its allies again. And the second vital interest, which is not mentioned often, is also the safety of Pakistan's nuclear weapons. Of course, if Afghanistan becomes more destable, that will have its negative impact on Pakistan's stability as well. And as far as the success is concerned, I think success in Afghanistan for the United States would be to enable the Afghan government to control and govern its territory and police its border with very minimal foreign assistance. And I think that, as Ambassador Neumann alluded to, there has been some progress in Afghanistan. Of course, we are always talking about the challenges, but we don't talk about one that Ambassador Neumann mentioned. There has not been any major terrorist attacks on the U.S. soil emanating from Afghanistan. And the U.S. military and intelligence presence in Afghanistan was key to degrading al-Qaeda core in the AfPak region. And also, it is the U.S. military and intelligence presence now in Afghanistan which is countering the emerging threat of ISIS in Afghanistan as well. But of course, to build on these gains, the United States and international community needs to further strengthen the Afghan military and civilian institutions, degrade the Taliban, which has gained momentum recently, and also forge a regional consensus for cooperation on a stable and prosperous Afghanistan, that Afghanistan is not a battlefield for proxy war, but it is a hub for regional connectivity. And regarding the conditions-based, I think that the Obama administration's timeline, they undermined both the military mission and the diplomatic mission in Afghanistan. It emboldened the Taliban that a military victory is possible and the United States is soon to leave Afghanistan. It also sent a negative message to friends and allies inside Afghanistan and the region. We saw that NATO followed suit and they withdrew their troops from the country. And also, I remember the Taliban were repeating that mantra that the United States have watch, we have the time, so we can outlast the US. And based on that recognition, the Trump administration has changed those time-based approach to a more conditions-based approach. And lastly, I agree with Vanda that the Obama administration meant to put pressure on the Afghan government to bring about more effective governance and tackle corruption issues. But the outcome of the timelines were negative. We saw that corruption becomes more endemic. The Afghan leaders, businesses, they started to send their capitals to Dubai and other regions instead of just keeping it in Afghanistan, because the year 2014 had become the year of doom and gloom. So everybody was just hedging their bets. And I was in Pakistan. I remember I spoke to a former head of ISI, and he talked about some of Pakistan's concerns in Afghanistan. And I asked him why you're not following that with the Afghan government to address them. And he said, well, the US is leaving, and we are not sure about this political system in Afghanistan. So that also discouraged Pakistan to play a more effective role. So that's why I think that this shift from time-based to condition-based is the right approach.
Well, would you agree that condition-based doesn't mean unconditional staying? That is, not an indefinite commitment. It does imply, in fact, that we'll make our decision based on the circumstances as they emerge. And I think some people at least have read that, well, we're there for forever because of not having given up on the timelines, therefore there is no time basis here for. So I think that we ought to have that on the table. Chris?
So what does winning look like? Well, it's very simple. You lay out you identify your interests, the reasons why you went to war, and winning looks like your ability to achieve those interests. And there are three methods by which wars can end in a country achieving its interest. First of all, they can end in decisive victory, right? Ron Neumann mentioned surrender ceremony on the battleship Missouri. Certainly the most desirable way to end a conflict, but may not always be the most realistic, particularly in these kind of conflicts. Two other ways that wars can end in a successful outcome are to transition. If you're an intervening power, you can work together with the host nation government and at some point transition the responsibility for winning the war to the host nation government and you leave, which is what the Obama administration tried to do with their approach. The third approach is to get a negotiated outcome. And a negotiated outcome that achieves your interests is by definition a win. That's what winning looks like.
That's a perfect. Please come in.
I want to get in something before you segue, obviously, to negotiations where Chris has given you this wonderful opening.
Indeed, he has.
First of all, I want to agree with Vanda. We do that often. That every administration has struggled with what this looks like. I would differ slightly on saying there is nothing there, because there is, I think they called it a compact, and maybe now it's an executive agreement. It's a multi-page spreadsheet of things they're supposed to be doing in timelines. I don't necessarily think it has total reality, but it exists. I think the big question when you want to do conditionality is a question of political will. And it's a question of judgment, and it's always going to be excruciatingly difficult, because these things will never be sufficiently clear to be automatic. There will always be a tendency to say, well, we should give it more time or stay, no matter what happens. So there will always be a tension. That tension leads me just to note that where we are now with this policy, I think, should be much more a debate about execution than a debate about policy. They've bought into a policy which is going to take a long time to do. And they're doing a miserable job, by the way, of explaining that. I mean, I've looked at some of the unclassified but internal charts of what you're supposed to get out of the military, the increase in advising and training. And where you see that showing up in our expectation, which could well be exaggerated, is well into 2019 or 2020, because that's what it takes to make changes in training and leadership, assuming you don't undercut the process by lack of political will. So, you know, we need to understand, and this is going to be really hard to do from America, is to track the kind of things that tell you actually whether you're making progress or not, because they're going to be in the details of execution and not the big pieces of policy.
Before we go on to the next question, I see a number of seats down front here, so please take, we're giving you a little time here to find a seat. There are two down here, one over there, two over here. Please join us.
Marvin, can I come to the question of conditions
quickly.
that you raised? You know, I think that a lot of the focus is on under what conditions are we successful, in particular in the handover that Chris spoke about. How do we measure those? I would posit that it is imperative that the United States as a society, the administration as the government, answers the questions under what conditions we leave. And those conditions are not simply when we have reached the stage of victory, but at what point Afghanistan has really not become a viable partner. At what point it's merely an illusion that we will persist and hope that things break. We are currently in a policy that is staying and hoping that the Taliban will make enough mistakes and that the Afghan government will finally, and not just government, but crucially the Afghan political class will finally start behaving. We have not yet resolved how to create inducements for either side to move from that hoping, praying strategy. It is the least bad strategy. If we leave today, we will have a very nasty, bloody civil war on our hands. We have responsibility for avoiding that civil war. But we also have to think very hard is at what point we are simply not going to achieve even a modicum of objectives. In my view, they are the Afghan security actors, Afghan military, split along ethnic lines. There is a very protracted political crisis over the 2019 political elections. I can guarantee that there will be one. I am going to be daring. I can make bets with you. The question is how protracted it will become and whether it will spill into actual violence, whether this is going to set actual civil strife. That, for me, would be one of the very crucial triggers when we say we are no longer staying. And I think there are several others. I will not preempt the time, but I just want to highlight it's not enough to say when things are good enough that we can leave because things are good enough, but things are bad enough that we shouldn't be staying.
I'm going to do two fingers on that one. Yes. So I'm going to just want to build on what Vanda said because I think it's really important. Look, there are three ways wars end: decisive victory, transition, negotiated outcome. And part of the responsibility for policymakers and people doing strategy is to evaluate which one of those options, which one of those methods for concluding the war successfully has the most realistic chance of leading to a favorable and durable outcome at the least possible cost in blood, treasure, and time. So you can take each of these three and you can look at, well, what are the prospects of decisive victory? What actually are the prospects of the Taliban surrendering or ceasing to exist? And you can evaluate those possibilities. You can also examine the possibilities of what is the likelihood that we will achieve this sort of what people call this crossover point, where the Afghan government achieves this position of dominance over the Taliban, and the Taliban are degraded to the point at which the Afghan government can then defeat them decisively and we can leave. You can evaluate the likelihood, the probability of that occurring. In fact, we've already had a run at that for the last 17 years. And then you can look at the probability that a negotiated outcome will meet your interests, because ultimately you go to war to meet your interests. And as my colleagues have said, we've said our interests are making sure Afghanistan is no longer a launching pad for al-Qaeda or other groups to stage large-scale attacks against the United States and our allies. We've certainly talked about Afghanistan being at peace with itself and with its neighbors. And we've spent a lot of time talking about human rights in Afghanistan. And to the extent to which, when you look at these three options, you evaluate to what extent am I going to achieve those interests realistically of these three options. One might be more desirable than others, but the key is which one is the most realistic, and that's what we need to evaluate.
Thank you. I'm going to combine the next two questions because they are so closely related, and we're also loquacious group up here, so we'll have to recognize that. One of the criticisms that one hears all the time is that we really have not given the proper focus on a diplomatic approach, on seeking a political solution for Afghanistan. What, at this point in time, after these many years, and particularly with the backdrop of some recent developments here from a Taliban letter, but also a guerrilla campaign that has been going on, increased intensity here in the cities, to what extent now should we be using our energy here to get a negotiation started? How high should this be on our priorities? And what would successful negotiations look like? What should the U.S. and Kabul government in that situation demand? What can they demand? Obviously, everyone would like to see talks begin, but most of what we've been seeing here is talking about getting talks going, and very little, if any, on whether there really is the basis here for a negotiated settlement, at least at this point in time. So just to conclude this thought, would we be prepared? We know what we would like to see, and that is that the Taliban or insurgency in general buys into a pluralistic, democratic, constitutional system. That's been the offer. Come sit down with us, and we'll hammer out an agreement that we can all agree on, but within this framework. Are we prepared to have the Taliban say to us, look, okay, let's negotiate, but not on your terms, on our terms. We'll tell you how we'll fit you into a Islamic emirate. And we'll be more tolerant than we were in the past. So where are we in all of this? Ahmed?
Yeah, of course. If you read the commentary in the media, let's say in the past 6 months, almost all opinion pieces on Afghanistan start by highlighting the challenges and concluding by saying that there is no military solution, we need to negotiate peace with the Taliban. And if you do not follow Afghanistan very closely, you might be just misled to believe that it is the US and Afghan governments that do not want peace with the Taliban, and they are, or maybe perhaps they are not making enough efforts to do so. But the reality is that both Kabul and Washington over the past decade have consistently called on the Taliban to come to the negotiating table for a political settlement to end the war. And we've seen that both Kabul and Washington have given the Taliban unilateral concessions. We've seen that the Taliban have used talks to increase its legitimacy and recognition. They have opened offices from Qatar to Iran, and they've increased their diplomatic outreach from Russia to China. We've seen that the Karzai government, for example, released hundreds of Taliban prisoners. The Kabul government in indirect talks have offered government positions to the Taliban. But what have we gotten from the Taliban is only increased violence. They have not cut ties with the Al-Qaeda. And also, most importantly, they have not, up to today, agreed to sit down and talk with the Kabul government, because their ultimate goal remains the reestablishment of the Islamic Emirate. And even recently, that the Taliban spokesperson sent this letter to the American people. They were talking about holding negotiations with the U.S. about the withdrawal of U.S. troops, not about just making peace with the Afghan government. So far, the talks have only benefited the Taliban. They have increased their legitimacy and power, while the Afghans and their international partners have not benefited them. And regarding the second part of your question, I think that any negotiations between the Taliban should be with the Afghan government. And secondly, there should be a national consensus within Afghanistan also about any reconciliation with the Taliban. I don't think that peace with the Taliban at this point is realistic. They have not been willing to make peace or to reach a settlement in the past. Now that they have the momentum, they are controlling more territory than any time since 2001. They have even less incentive to make peace. They believe in a military victory. But even if they agree to a reconciliation without a national consensus within Afghanistan, that reconciliation would be a peace recipe for more chaos, civil strife, and a repetition of 1990s rather than a stable Afghanistan. So that's why we need more stability, first of all, both on the security and political fronts in Afghanistan for any reconciliation to succeed. And also there are lessons to be learned from the reconciliation process during the Soviet Union. After they withdrew, they pursued a similar strategy, and we saw the after effects of that, that those groups who, even that some of those groups who joined the Afghan government, they played a role in toppling the Afghan government later. So I think that in my view, the best way to approach the reconciliation issue is to have our expectations realistic, to focus on, because there are two things that in my opinion could bring the Taliban to real negotiations. First, it would be that the Afghan government becomes more competent, it tackles corruptions, and it works on building its institutions so that the Taliban don't see a military victory possible. And secondly, also, it's the support network that Taliban maintains in Pakistan, because if Pakistan reverses its decision and puts pressure on Pakistan, that could be a game changer. But right now, I think that the best approach would be to focus on stability in Afghanistan, degrading the Taliban's power, at the same time trying to peel off some of the not the ideological core of the Taliban, but some of those Taliban groups that who are fighting for money, for power, for other incentives that could be reconciled. So reintegration rather than reconciliation seems more realistic.
I do, but I know I want to let somebody else go first.
I think that we, the United States, the international community involved, very much need to get into the political prism of thinking about the conflict. That includes many dimensions to it, one of which is how do we pick targeting? What kind of leadership structures on the side of the Taliban do we want to have in place to be able to ensure that there is, in fact, an interlocutor who will at one point be interested in negotiating, and that interlocutor has the capacity to inform any sort of negotiated deal. I agree with Ahmed that right now, and frankly for a while, the Taliban has few incentives. It has many incentives to negotiate. And I think there are real reasons to engage in negotiations. But it has very few incentives to come to a deal. It's not going to come to a deal before the 2019 presidential elections. It will not know when any kind of deal will be viable. And in fact, if the Afghan political class handles the elections as yet another protracted crisis, that will be enormously advantageous for the Taliban. But at the end of the day, there will be negotiations. They might not involve the United States. We might long be gone, and it might be negotiations after a tremendous bloodbath. So Chris was very crucial in his comments in saying we not only need to think about what is ideal, but also what is realistic. And it might be that we would love to have a negotiations when the Taliban is really weak and when it comes to a deal that we very much want to see. Those negotiations might not arrive, and rather the negotiations might be after a significant civil war. The negotiations in Colombia came at a situation where there was a significant stalemate. The FARC was weakened in a way that the Taliban is nowhere weakened, but the government also maxed out its military capacity, and the government understood it. Now, the negotiations took still 4 years. There are many issues. There is never national consensus. But one of the crucial elements that a country can do, that Afghanistan must do, I would posit, in preparing for that negotiated outcome one day, is to do the healing with itself that it needs to do. Is to do the healing between the Afghan society and the Afghan government to start engaging in serious national interest behavior among the Afghan political elites. The Afghan political elite still profits and misbehaves enormously in the context of the fighting. The fighting is very convenient for the Afghan political elite. And that's part of the issue of our staying and what kind of role do we play. At what point does the Afghan political class becomes responsible for the national interest of the country?
Should we keep in mind that negotiations is a very broad term? You can negotiate after this bloody civil war, which Vanda's talking about, you can negotiate effectively the terms of surrender. That's negotiations too.
Including our surrender.
Including, yes. So I think that when we talk about negotiations, it's not bounded by the idea that somehow what it means is a trade-off. There's some kind of compromise of interests. Negotiations has to be, when we use that term, let's use it carefully.
I think you're putting your finger on something that's very important, which is that the American, no, it's not just America, the Western discussion of negotiation has been almost unbounded by any particular thought. It has been a drifting over a kind of verbal prairie in which negotiations are good. And since they are good, we should push for them. And that is almost the limitation of the intellectual effort that has gone into this. A great deal of tactical effort has gone into trying it, and almost no intellectual effort. There are some baseline questions which I will just state. I will not try to answer them. One is, what kind of negotiation, to the extent negotiation is part of our policy, what kind of negotiation is, what kind of result is acceptable? Negotiation is a tool. It's not a goal. It is a method of getting to a goal. We have to define what we would consider the minimal terms of a negotiation. We keep chasing a method without an objective. That has an absurdity to it. Secondly, we need to remember that no inter-Afghan agreement of the last 40 years has been kept. So if negotiation is a route to a solution, you can use it as a route to just getting out and surrendering. That's a different purpose, but at least you should know what the purpose is. But if you conceive of negotiation as some ending which is not simply an abandonment of American goals, then you need to talk about verification and how it will be enforceable. If we have had, not only have we had zero discussion of that, we have zero thought. There is no process ongoing in the federal government, nor has there been in any previous one, talking about how any form of agreement is to be verified and is to be enforced. And if you don't do that, you are just blowing smoke.
Marvin, can I just quickly add something? Yeah. On two issues. One, on the issue of the preconditions that other speakers talked about. The issue of preconditions in talks with the Taliban have already changed to necessary outcomes. So there are no preconditions from the Afghan government or the U.S. if the Taliban wants to join. But those necessary outcomes are that the Taliban cut ties with Al-Qaeda, accept Afghan constitution, and also renounce violence and become part of the political process. And in response to the issue, to your question about just can we even consider surrendering to the Taliban and tolerate an Islamic emirate that could perhaps guarantee that it will not house Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups that would attack the United States again, I think that would be repeating the same mistake of 1990s and expecting a different result. Because if you look at the declassified documents available at George Washington University about the diplomatic engagements between the Taliban and the United States diplomats in the 1990s, you see that they give all these assurances to the US diplomats that Taliban will not allow Al-Qaeda to establish its bases, but we know what happened. So how can the United States and the international community or even the Afghans can rely on those Taliban assurances yet again? And in terms of the civil war, this civil war, if that happens, that we let Afghans just fight each other and after that they come to a negotiated settlement after that they become tired of war. They may not become tired of war. They have fought for 40 years now. And this civil war will be much deadlier than the civil war of 1990s because the Afghans are much more armed with very heavy weapons. There will be, of course, fragmentation of the Afghan National Army based on factional, regional, and ethnic groups. So there will not, even if the United States accept a settlement with the Taliban, a Taliban victory and control of Afghanistan is not guaranteed. So there will be civil war, and the Taliban would need Al-Qaeda and regional terrorist groups to do its war against its competitors and rivals inside the country.
Yeah, just to add to that, wouldn't you agree that unlike the 90s, when one side lost and one side won, essentially, the government ran away and the Taliban simply took over the cities. Today, Vanda, you've spoken on this in the past, this would be a much more chaotic civil war because we might even find insurgents fighting against insurgents, not to mention the various factions and warlords and power brokers fighting among themselves for turf, so that you have added to that the proxies of Russia and Iran and Pakistan.
Think Lebanon.
think Lebanon. Chris.
8755. If you go to Section 60 in Arlington National Cemetery and you go to gravesite 8755, you will see Major Tom Bostic buried there, surrounded by hundreds and hundreds of American service members who have given their lives in Afghanistan. There are a lot of us here in this room that have spent a lot of time working on Afghanistan, a lot of sacrifices from people in this room in Afghanistan. We have an obligation to our country, to the people who have put their lives on the line, to make sure that we get a successful outcome in Afghanistan at the least possible cost in blood, treasure, and time. And at the same time, I think we need to change the narrative on Afghanistan. We got to stop all the hand-wringing. The progress that has been made in Afghanistan has been absolutely extraordinary. If you look at what the country was like in 2001 and compared to what it's like in 2018, it's absolutely tremendous in nearly any measure that you wish to take. Education, health, Afghan National Security Forces, amount of roads paved and constructed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think we also ought to consider that 17 years of relentless pressure, both domestically within Afghanistan and from the international community, has an effect on our adversaries. Some of those effects are for good, some of those effects are for ill. But when you begin to put all of this together, I believe that a successful outcome in Afghanistan is within sight, if we just take the blinders off long enough to see it. The 17 years of relentless domestic pressure from Afghans, pressure from the international community, the knowledge that, look, the United States is going to be in Afghanistan for a really long time. And all of the fears that my colleagues have talked about in terms of what a civil war might look like in terms of this free-for-all has actually brought the Taliban to the point where they were willing to make this statement on the February 14th that said, look, America, you've said you got three interests in Afghanistan. You want to make sure there's no terrorists that are going to attack you. You want to make sure that there's a legitimate government that represents the interests of the people, and you want to make sure that there's no drugs coming out of Afghanistan. Well, guess what, America? We are willing to help you out with that.
Let's take it.
Okay, you'll get your chance.
They said we're willing to help you out with that. And they said we need to begin a peace dialogue, but we agree with you on these goals. Now, I tell you what, when your adversary evolves their position over time to the point at which they are saying, we have no problem with your war aims, and in fact, we will help you achieve them, that's something to take very seriously. Potentially, that may be what winning looks like. Now, as my colleagues have said, how you go into a negotiation, what your strategy is for that negotiation, you could do really well or really stupidly. And to date, we have not thought systematically about what a peace process might look like and how to do it smartly so we achieve a favorable and durable outcome that advances our interests.
Do we have any other interpretations of that letter? Because that letter clearly it's a 10-page letter, something like that, and it's written with enormous sophistication here, the sort of thing that we never saw from the Taliban in the past. Obviously, they understood what buttons to push here. Does anybody want to comment on this?
Just one point, that there's a context here, and Majidyar made noted it before. Taliban continually insist they want to negotiate with America, not with the Afghans. We have continually insisted that if a peace is to have any durability, it has to be between Afghans, and they have to negotiate with each other. And actually, despite Mr. Trump's rhetoric, that position has remained. They haven't broken off all contacts. But I think it is possible to see this letter in terms of a bid, another bid, to do the negotiations with the Americans, in which the final deal is essentially a deal on paper and we leave, after which, depending on your point of view, you have a deal that maybe meets our objectives, or you have simply walked out on the Allied government in Afghanistan before it's strong enough to stand up, and the Taliban take advantage of that situation and win a war. Either is possible. You can argue endlessly about it, but you can certainly look at this letter as a tactical ploy to up the pressure for the Americans to call it victory and get out. And then you have to answer the question of whether you believe that the negotiation thus reached without the kind of verification and enforcement that I've talked about has value or meaning. I personally don't believe it, but that's another argument that one can have.
We could also ask, who's the negotiating partner here? This is not the Taliban of Mullah Omar, where someone could speak authoritatively for the Taliban. Today, I think my panelists will agree, the Taliban is a much more decentralized organization, not to mention the existence of Islamic State as a player here, a player who is not inconsequential and has made it very clear that they have no interest in negotiations, whether this would be a magnet for Taliban people who are not happy with sitting down to then aligning themselves with the Islamic State seems very plausible to me. So I think the point of all this is that we've got some apparent options here, but we better be careful as we approach them. Vanda?
You know, Marvin, I think that's the right frame to put on it. Just because one enters into negotiations doesn't mean that one makes any kind of deal. So Ron is absolutely correct in pointing out that we need to think about what are the terms that we would not accept, what are the risks, what are the consequences. There continues to be very strong, appropriate reasons to insist on the Afghan government being part of the negotiations. The negotiations will involve the United States. They are not going to happen without the United States, but we can certainly insist on the Afghan government, and we need to insist on the Afghan government being part of it. Just because you negotiate, you don't have to accept. And that, of course, applies to the Taliban. I am not so concerned about the fact that the Taliban is, that the Islamic State allows for greater possibility of defection. That is bad. That's very unfortunate. That should not be the reason not to negotiate. I do think it was a big strategic mistake into which Pakistan suckered us to eliminate Mullah Mansour. And that we would have been much better off in having him in leadership today, and with the letter coming with some plausibility that his endorsement might be behind it. And so this goes back to my comments that we need to get away from the frame of our sole purpose being simply to weaken and fragment the Taliban, and because we want them weaker because we think that the weaker Taliban will make better negotiated deal, or because the Afghan government will defeat it. But think about targeting in what kind of negotiating partner with what kind of attitudes. Or interlocutor, let me not use the term partner, we want and the Afghan government should have. Baselines matter, and here is perhaps where I differ somewhat with Chris. Yes, you can set the baseline as 1990s, 2001, 2002. You can set the baseline as 2010, 2011, in fact 2014, and think of the perspective of the Taliban and what has happened since. So yes, they are under pressure, they are degraded to some extent, they are facing some fragmentation more so, but not to the point of being debilitated at all, not to the point of not having regeneration capacity. Even with the presence of IS and some of the splintering, they are still incredibly unified in comparisons with,
as a military force.
As a military force in comparison with many insurgent groups. So the more short-term, immediate baselines are not looking so dire. But I am very concerned and very distressed when I hear Ahmed say, well, we Afghans, the Afghans, we can fight for a long time. And this is at the core of my problem with our engagement, that as long as it is the United States saying, you Afghans, you should want peace, you need to engage in healing and reconciliation, we are failing. The Afghans need to say, we don't want to experience the 1990s. We don't want to fight. And then we can get into discussion, how do you have enforcement mechanism in place that a deal is not reneged on, not just by the Taliban, but by the very many actors, by the northern actors. But I am distressed when I hear we can go on fighting. Well, if this is the case, then there is very little that we can continue doing.
Can I clarify my comments?
Yes.
Yeah. I didn't say, or at least I didn't mean that the Afghans, they want war, or they want to fight longer. Actually, many opinion polls have showed that a majority of Afghans, they want a peaceful settlement with the Taliban. But they don't want a peaceful settlement that comes at the cost of all the gains that they have gotten over the past 16 years. And when I said that they might not be tired of war, I was talking about the Taliban and potential warlords and who had fought the Taliban in the past, that the fight will be between them, not the Afghan people. The Afghan people, of course, they have suffered a lot over the past 40 years. And they're happy about some of the gains that they have made. They want to sustain and build on that, and they want the support of the international community. And if the Taliban wants to make peace, they have shown, all different ethnic groups, that they are willing to make peace with the Taliban. But again, it is always just the Taliban that just rejecting peace. And in terms of the 2014, that why just the Taliban made a comeback and became even more stronger. And again, it goes to the premature and very rapid withdrawal of forces, because, of course, one of the success of the Obama's surge policy was the strengthening of the Afghan security forces, because the Bush administration had did not pay enough attention to that. But still, by 2011, that the withdrawal started and it completed in 2014. The Afghan security forces had made remarkable progress in terms of size and capabilities, but they were still not ready to take on the Taliban by themselves. And also some of the restrictions on the rules of engagement also tied the hands of the US military to just help the Afghans in terms of the air operations and others. So the Taliban changed their tactics that, for example, before they were in group of 5 and 6, just mostly focusing on spectacular and suicide attacks. then they could gather in hundreds and just even overrun districts and even twice or three times provincial centers. So that is one mistake that I think that needs to be just avoided in future.
I'm going to let you talk, but we are running out of time, and I'm going to have to pass over a couple of questions that I thought were pretty good. But there's one last question I want to raise. But Chris, before I do,
I think one of the challenges that we're having as a country, wrapping our minds around this, is the reason why the Taliban are interested in negotiations is coming about in a way different than we have possibly imagined. Whether it's the Trump administration or the Obama administration or the Bush administration, we've always had this presumption, this mental model that says we are going to build capacity of the Afghan government until they achieve a position of dominance over the Taliban. We are going to put enough pressure on Pakistan to where they turn against the Taliban, and we are going to hammer away at the Taliban so hard that they are going to sue for peace. And the negotiation is sort of on the margins of their essential surrender, right? It's the battleship Missouri, it's the World War II and the Pacific outcome, where we negotiated with the Japanese for whether they could keep the emperor in Japan or not. But at the end of the day, it was about Japanese surrender. We negotiated a little bit on the margins. That's been our mental model. But the challenge is that the Afghan government has not yet achieved a position of dominance, and it doesn't seem it's going to happen anytime in the near future. And it doesn't seem like Afghan politics are getting more stable over time. In fact, they seem to be getting less stable. Regional dynamics are not getting more stable over time. They're getting less stable. And the Afghan Taliban has been making territorial and population gains in Afghanistan to the point at which they've got durable internal support and they've got durable external sanctuary. In many ways, the Afghan people enough Afghan people have voted to enable the Taliban to continue fielding a team, and regional actors have voted to enable the Taliban to continue to supply that team. So this Taliban request for negotiations is different fundamentally this time because it comes from this position in which the Taliban have been under such pressure. It's not that they are about to surrender. It's that the pressure has made them change their policies over time. And the timeline says, hey, the Americans aren't going anywhere. And the Taliban say, look, we are concerned about a Syria-like scenario in Afghanistan. And so we're willing to have this overture. Now, the question, as Ron put, is how do you go about this in a way that doesn't create a chaotic outcome, but one that creates a favorable and durable outcome? And that's a question that's a strategy question about how you do negotiations, which maybe we can get into.
And this goes back to my comment. We will have negotiations. The question is where. The Taliban, to the extent that the offer is credible, and we don't know how unified leadership that is behind that, but they are coming to negotiating to the proposition, perhaps with simply a tactical ruse to weaken our will, but quite possibly because they actually feel pretty confident.
And it's easy enough to test all of this.
Absolutely. So we can. There are some costs to negotiations, but not sufficient to avoid having the negotiations. That doesn't mean that we have to accept everything.
Ron, you wanted to get a word in?
Well, just in case it was getting too clear. Let me just suggest that there is a completely different alternative analysis from Chris's of what the Taliban has done. And I don't think there, frankly, is evidence to reach either one. But you have a new strategy by the Trump administration. You also have a president who is known to be somewhat flighty and who didn't really want to stay. It is perfectly possible that what you're seeing in the combination of the violent attacks in Kabul against civilians and in this negotiating ploy are simply a tactical effort to break that policy, to get us to move in a different direction. And this is reminiscent of what the Taliban did in 2005 and 2006 when NATO was beginning to take over. Taliban was very aware of all the public discussions in the NATO European countries, how shaky some of those commitments were, the domestic opposition to going in. And so you saw a major Taliban effort that cost them a lot of casualties in 2006 to produce pitched battle, which I think the only explanation could be that they knew that they hoped that would break NATO's political will. So, you know, maybe you're getting a shift now because Taliban's feeling pressure. Maybe you're getting a repeat of a Taliban tactic we've seen before that shows nothing of the kind and is simply an effort to break our will.
Notice though, that the letter comes in the wake of President Trump saying no negotiations. In effect, well, almost immediately, not just a letter, what came out of this was that the onus is now on the United States as the non-negotiating party out there. So what you could argue, I think follows from Ron, this was an opportunistic moment in which to throw the United States on the defensive here. So I'm never going to get to my most important questions here. It's a hopeless situation, but only for the best of reasons, because we've had this, I think, animated discussion. So I'm going to start right down. Let me say first, please introduce yourself. One question and short, or I'll cut you off. No, I was to this woman back here. I'll get to you, Tammy.
Hi, my name is Ann Rutherford, and I just needed to get into the weeds on where the Taliban is getting their oxygen, that we had gone in as supporting the Afghans, and they were doing the fighting, and then we went to special forces that started doing no-knock raids. So we have a lot of animosity towards America because of what Americans had done. And when we started to leave, it was, if they just had their own military, if they had their own aircrafts, you can't fight insurgents without the aircrafts. So if we just gave them the aircrafts, then they could support themselves. And then where is Russia in this? I mean, Russia is probably
You've got a number of questions in here.
Sorry, yes.
Let me just give an opportunity here. Anybody want to respond to this?
Do you want to take a couple of questions at once?
Oh, yeah, that's probably a good idea, Chris. Thank you. Over here.
Hi, Doug Brooks, Afghan American Chamber of Commerce. My question is on the business community, which really it's been sort of stomped on during this whole process, but it should be the ones who are supporting the Afghan government and should be the ones pushing for peace talks and some sort of resolution and peace with Pakistan, where they do a lot of their trade. Why do we completely leave them out of all these solutions?
Okay, one more question. David?
Thank you. David Sedney. Most recently, I was the acting president of the American University of Afghanistan in Kabul for a period of about a year, ending last year. I have apologized, Marvin, more than one point. And the first one is Omid, whose comments I thought were great, made a statement that's false, that the Taliban today control more territory than in time since 2001. That's a statement that was made, repeated in a Senate hearing. There is no authoritative statement to that effect. In fact, from everything I've looked at, the Taliban control less territory now than they did a year ago, slightly less. So it's very dangerous to repeat things that you hear that aren't authoritatively
David, would you
sourced.
distinguish between controlling territory and influence?
No, controlling and influencing. They control and influence less territory now than they did a year ago. The statement that they control and influence more territory now than ever since 2001 is a false statement. And if you look at it, and I'll be happy to talk to people about that. The second point about the Taliban and the letter and the peace process, the Taliban is not fragmented, but it has a lot of different strains in it. And one of the strains that's influencing the Taliban, I believe, from what I've talked about, is that people I've talked to, is the Taliban's internal problems with the civilian casualties they're causing. They are getting a lot of pushback from other Taliban that they are doing too much to kill innocent Afghans. And that is, I think, part of the process that's going on here. And I think it's important to realize that the Taliban are not unitary. They do have different political political factions. So I'm happy to have people comment on that, but thank you.
Okay, thank you.
I want to come to the issue of the Taliban oxygen and sort of challenge the notion that if only we give more hardware to the Afghan military, including aircraft, and which they of course need air power, we won't have the same problems. At the core of the day, the Taliban oxygen is misgovernance in Afghanistan, the lack of reckoning that the Afghan power brokers have, and polity more broadly, has done with itself. And that needs to change. That should be part of the negotiations. I was suggesting that the power brokers need to come to their own accountability. A lot of the negotiations is not negotiations merely or solely, or even I would say primarily between the Afghan government and the Taliban, but is among the Afghan political class and their willingness to start acting with some responsibility with national interest toward their own people. And, sir, you said, why do we leave the Afghan business community? The way I would phrase it, why does the Afghan business community leave itself out? Why does it continue to benefit from the lack of rule of law, from the corruption, from the abuses of power? I would throw that same onus back to what can and what must the Afghans do for themselves?
Anyone else want to comment?
A couple of points that weren't touched on quickly. Yes, we do need to do correctly the job we did in bits and pieces and didn't do on building an army and an air force. And in fact, that's part of what policy is supposed to do. But it's not a hardware delivery piece, and another part of the whole corruption and governance is if the Afghan government does not cease or does not make a real commitment to a professional military rather than a politicized one, then the hardware is not going to do any good. You're going to just do the repeat of things we've seen in Vietnam and other places. When you get inefficient leaders appointed for political reasons, you will not get improvement no matter how much hardware you give them. You asked a question about the Russians. The Russians have been moving closer to the Taliban, as have the Iranians, and both of them give as their reason, and they're fairly public about this, they're concerned first about the growth of the Islamic State in Afghanistan, and secondly, in some cases, the Russian suspicion that we're actually doing something to help the Islamic State to hurt Russia. Very conspiratorial theory, but I've heard it from them. I don't know how much they believe it, but the fact is they're worried about our collapse and or our helping Islamic State, and they are moving to get closer to the Taliban, as are the Iranians, on the belief that they are less dangerous to the Russians or Iranians than are the Islamic State. This is a really lousy position. It is at least infected in part by a lot of doubts about where we are as well as where the Afghans are.
So it's a hedging strategy.
It's a hedging, but one's very dangerous for us.
Yeah, just about where the Taliban gets its oxygen. First of all, most of the Taliban fighters, they are Afghans, so they do have some level of support network inside Afghanistan, although one Asia Foundation poll found only 5% public support for the Taliban, but that's still significant. Secondly, I think Vanda mentioned, it's the incompetence and bad governance of the Afghan government, which provides just a space for the Taliban and also for those who are disgruntled to join the Taliban. And third, it's also the very extensive support network that the Taliban have in Pakistan, whether they are the madrasas that they produce the fighters, or whether they are the religious groups that support the Taliban, or whether it's some level of state support that comes from ISI and others. So that keeps the Taliban, of course, going. And in terms of Russia and Iran, as Ambassador mentioned, it is that or Marvin used a word of hedging strategy, that these countries, they are not very certain about the final outcome of Afghanistan. So they want to just like play both sides of the conflict. They want to have their diplomatic relationship with the Taliban, that if Afghanistan descends into chaos and civil war, then they have their own actors that they can secure their own interest. And the issue of ISIS Although I used to think that the Iranians and Russians don't believe it. They're making this an excuse. But recently I'm saying that, no, there is real belief within the political circles in Iran and both in Russia that this conspiracy that U.S. is supporting ISIS in Afghanistan. So that's why they see the Taliban as kind of a countermeasure to fight the Taliban. Russians don't want ISIS to gain a foothold in northern Afghanistan. Iran doesn't want them in western Afghanistan along its borders. So that's part of the puzzle. And regarding the issue of Taliban territory, it is true that the Taliban controlled more territory than any time since 2001, a year ago. It's only over the past 6 months that because of the stepped-up military operations that it has not only reversed the Taliban momentum, but also it also has helped the Afghans to take the initiative and also retake some of that territory. Although that territory regained from the Taliban is not significant, so the Taliban still maintains. But at the same time, I would like to just mention that, for example, a recent BBC report that the Taliban has control or influence over 70% of Afghanistan, that could be misleading. Because if you measure that in terms of where the Taliban has the potential to carry out attack, then you can argue that all of Afghanistan, 100% that could be true. The terrorist groups have the potential of even carrying attacks in Paris. But the ability to carry out attacks in Kabul doesn't mean that they control or have influence over Kabul.
But it also doesn't mean that they don't have influence on the population and their concerns about the war.
They do have influence, of course, over the population. But in terms of that, which districts, which areas that the Taliban control, if you look at that map, you'll see that still it's the Afghan government which is in control of most of the population centers, while Taliban controls areas that are very densely populated.
At the same time that they can penetrate, they've demonstrated even those controlled areas.
Always.
Yes. I'm going to take 3 questions.
Sorry, Chris. Go ahead. Thanks.
I think the whole argument's bogus.
Yeah, I think that,
I think the whole argument.
look, we don't know exactly why the Taliban sent this 14 February letter. I offered one theory of the case. Ron offered a different theory of the case. And we can test these propositions at very low cost, but with very high potential payoff. But one of the challenges is that we are not yet in a position to be able to test that effectively, unfortunately. The second is that there's actually a cost of waiting. There is a cost of delay for all the reasons that my colleague mentioned. The growing internal instability, the growing external influence with various Afghan actors, the rise of ISIS, all of these issues mean that the domestic and international situation in Afghanistan is not getting more stable. It appears to be getting a bit less stable. So, and finally, the Taliban are not on the brink of surrender. So, when you examine these issues, the logic of at least testing whether there's a sincere opportunity for a peace process is well worth the price of admission.
Okay. 3 quick questions, Tammy, but quickly.
My name is Kami Bhatt. I'm with the Pakistani Spectator, and my question is to Majidyar. You said that pressuring Pakistan could be a game changer. Do you really mean that asking our Indian friend to pack their bag, who have put Pakistani Balochistan on fire? Otherwise, I mean, in literal sense, we've been pressuring Pakistan since September 11 and didn't change any game. Why do you think it would change the game now? Thanks.
Okay, Kami, thank you. All the way in the back, the gal all the way in the back.
Piggybacking off that last question, it seems like the chickens are finally coming home to roost in Pakistan after very many years of destabilizing or helping destabilize its neighbors. Seems
Can you
like
speak a little
Sorry, it seems like the violence that Pakistan has propagated in Afghanistan, it seems to be materializing on Pakistani soil now. Can you tell me what this development, what effect it has on Pakistan taking accountability for creating this nuisance?
Okay, so we got two questions here on Pakistan. Does anyone have a question here on Pakistan? You do. On Pakistan? No.
You want Pakistan or Afghanistan?
No, there was something about Pakistan's time. Yeah, something related, so we can have three related questions. So we're running out of time, unfortunately. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Nathaniel Debevoise, a research intern at the Heritage Foundation. With regard to Pakistan, the point was made that there's some strategic importance in maintaining a presence in Afghanistan to secure the potential for Pakistan to destabilize and their nukes to fall in the hands of people we wouldn't want them to. So would you say perhaps that there's some utility in maintaining either a semi-permanent or a permanent presence in Afghanistan, given that fact?
That was going to be one of my questions. Okay. Vanda, thoughts?
Pakistan is a critical player. It clearly enables the Afghan Taliban. It provides multiple forms of support for including its most vicious branch, the Haqqanis, and U.S. policy has been centering on and bewildering in dissuading Pakistan from that behavior since 2001. Whether this has ranged from pressure, cajoling, cooptation, making strategic deal, moving toward tactical bargaining, toward tactical payoffs. The Trump administration has given to many Afghan hands what they had been calling for a long time, very significantly stepped up pressure on Pakistan that can be further stepped up. I retain skepticism that the pressure will fundamentally change Pakistan's behavior. I believe that we can see marginal adjustments on the part of Pakistan, but I believe there are structural limitations and crucial interests of Pakistan, crucial fears of Pakistan, that simply upping up the pressure does not resolve. And then in any strategy in which we say we dial up the pain, we need to think of how Pakistan can dial up the pain back against us and, of course, against Afghanistan, which is not to say that we don't risk dialing up the pain, but I want us to be very clear-headed in having really thought through what Pakistan can do back to us. I would love to see Pakistan all of a sudden saying, okay, let us go after the Afghan Taliban, let us go after the Haqqanis. I'm skeptical that we will have that kind of blanket, resolute change in policy. I do want to say, though, that the clear reason why we are unlikely to have that change in policy is because we have vital and fundamental interests with Pakistan that go apart from Afghanistan, and then in some ways are far more fundamental than our interests in Afghanistan, whether it's the stability of nuclear weapons, getting Pakistan away from the deployment of tactical nuclear weapons, reducing chance and the risk that they can just be deployed inadvertently or fall into hands that we don't want to see, avoiding internal weakness of Afghanistan, avoiding some very difficult Pakistan-India military confrontation. And that's both a very important lever that Pakistan has, but also very important reality.
Pakistan has suffered a great deal from terrorism itself, and it has fought very hard against some aspects of terrorism. Much of the terrorism from which it suffers, however, is an outgrowth of groups which Pakistan has helped to create for other purposes. It is very difficult for anybody who's been in this game a long time to be completely clear-headed about something, because a lot of Americans have died and been injured because of Pakistan's support for the Taliban. If that support is allowed to continue, permitted, finished, or can't be stopped, then I think ultimately we're probably going to fail in Afghanistan. The level of pressure which it would take to change Pakistan is going to be extraordinarily high and may put at risk our other interests. We have to be very clear about that. I think we also have to understand that first of all, any policy of pressure on Pakistan has to be accompanied by a credible belief that some level of Pakistan's interests can be accommodated by a changed policy. You can't just do it out of a stick. And part of that is the question of whether we're willing to stick with a very long process in Afghanistan, because if we're not, then you just circle back to the fact that Pakistan's interests will almost compel it to keep its policy. And then you get to the point that neither to Afghans nor to Pakistanis can we prove that we're going to stay unless we stay. You can't do this I'm not arguing now whether you should or should not. I'm just saying that if staying is a part of credibility, then you can only do it by staying, because words have now been totally devalued in the context of multiple policy discussions. You can't think about leaving and prove you're going to stay. So we may fail that test. That's not an argument for doing something. It's just an observation that if we're going to put pressure on Pakistan, if we're going to push for changes in Afghanistan, if we're going to demand changes out of the Afghan leadership, then we will have to be resolute for a long time, and we will probably have a succession of crises with Pakistan, because things are going to get a lot worse, and it's going to go on for a long time. And we're going to have some major crises with the Afghans. And Vanda raised this question of what happens in the election. I think there are going to be places where we will have to be prepared to leave, particularly if there's a crisis like 2014 in the next election. We cannot succeed if we facilitate Afghan politicians in playing political games over the future of their country. So when at some point we get to some major crisis like that, I think we're going to have to be prepared to say, if you can't settle it, we are leaving. You have now demonstrated this policy cannot work. And if we haven't made up our minds to that, then we will fail that test.
Is there in this, though, a presumption here that Pakistan really is the key? As you describe it here, there's enough blame.
You know, we used to talk about a two-key approach to nuclear.
Okay.
I think we have a two-key approach here.
Okay.
One is Pakistan. If you continue to facilitate the sanctuaries, I think it's very difficult to conceive of how you can reach the kind of situation we want. But the other is Afghan performance. That's the second key. Right. If you don't get that, then even Pakistan change won't help.
Okay, good.
I'll just clarify my comments, because the remarks that you attributed to me, I didn't say that. I didn't mention about Indian role. I didn't say that bringing India to Afghanistan and putting pressure in Pakistan will be a game changer. What I did say was exactly what Ambassador Neumann just mentioned. The talk was about just the potential of negotiations with the Taliban. And I believe that the Taliban, what may bring the Taliban to the negotiating table and change their calculus about the outcome of war would be two things. One would be that the Afghans just keep their acts together. They improve governance, build their institutions, join hands to tackle the problems instead of just political bickering, and other corruption and other problems in Afghanistan. And so that the Taliban don't see a military victory a possibility. And the second, I said, would be that if Pakistan reverses its policy of supporting the Taliban and also deny the Taliban leadership sanctuary and also take action against state and non-state actors that provide some level of support to the Taliban, I said these two items will be a game changer.
Okay. That last question, though, we really, yeah, Chris?
Please.
Yeah.
I want to participate.
You got to just signal. Oh, sorry.
The Taliban already don't believe they're going to achieve a military victory. They've figured that out. And it absolutely is true. And they've also figured out that we're going to be there for a long time, that and that there's consequences to this sort of Syria-style civil war. At the same time, the idea of a deal, negotiating a deal is a four-letter word. And we shouldn't repeat the mistakes of the Peshawar Accords in 1992 and the Islamabad Accords in 1993, where there was a power-sharing deal that ended in civil war. Instead, we need to think maybe differently about how a peace process might be structured, and I'll offer three threes. This conflict is fought on three levels: an international level that involves us and Russia and other actors. There is a regional level: Afghan, Pakistan, India, Iran, the neighbors, and then there's a national level: Afghanistan government versus Taliban, ISIS, etc. A peace process has got to hit these three levels and ought to go in three steps: dialogue and confidence building measures to test the sincerity of different partners and get to an agreement, at least on an agenda for talks. Second step is discussions toward reductions in military violence, towards a ceasefire. And third and finally would be discussions, negotiations toward a political settlement. And the third three is third party. Something this complicated, something this complex needs professional assistance. And a third-party facilitator would be very helpful in orchestrating these three levels and these three steps. And this process is likely to take a decade or more, given the fact that Afghanistan's been at war for 40 years.
Okay, I can't close off without incorporating your question somehow. Because what you're saying, in effect, is that does the United States have a reason to want to remain in Afghanistan, which is independent of all the rest here, in the sense that we've got bigger concerns than Afghanistan, and even bigger concerns than Pakistan. We've got regional concerns, because if one goes now to Afghanistan or Pakistan and elsewhere, what you hear all the time is, you Americans, you're perpetuating the war. You want to remain. In fact, we hear this from Hamid Karzai, that we're supporting Islamic State. Why? In order to justify our remaining. Well, for some of us, that just strikes us as, come on now. But this resonates strongly in the region. The idea that the United States now has larger geostrategic reasons to want to be there. And there's China, there's conflict with Iran, there's naturally all the issues with Pakistan. So any kind of disengagement, especially one where we agreed to the Taliban to walk away, what does this mean here for our broader global strategy here with regard to those countries particularly that we consider adversaries or potential adversaries? I've got to close it off. I'm sorry if I got the...
leave with a question, not an answer.
Yeah,
okay.
I'm sorry if I got the last word, but I didn't take my prerogative before. I want to thank everyone for not only coming, but hanging on for another 5 minutes. I think you have to agree with me that this is the kind of discussion that we should be having all the time. This is the kind, I think, of clashing of thoughts here, and we've had some of that, but also some here, I think, conclusions that we could get consensus on here that we ought to use in what we saw here as finding the best way forward. So please join me in thanking the panelists.